I was sitting at a red light on a perfectly ordinary Thursday afternoon when my entire world shattered into a million pieces. My name is Jessica, and I'd been married to Daniel for 12 years, together for 15. We had what everyone called the perfect marriage, the kind that made our friends joke about how sickeningly in love we were. We had 2 beautiful kids, a comfortable home in the suburbs, and a relationship built on trust and communication, or so I thought. That Thursday, I was heading home early from my dental appointment, driving through downtown when I saw him. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. There, walking down 5th Street, was my husband, unmistakably Daniel with his distinctive walk and that navy blue jacket I'd given him for his birthday. But he wasn't alone. There was a woman next to him, and they weren't just walking together. His arm was around her waist in a way that was intimate, familiar, possessive. She was laughing at something, he'd said, tilting her head back in a way that spoke of comfort and closeness. And then, right there on the busy sidewalk with people rushing past them, he stopped, turned her toward him, and kissed her. Not a friendly peck, but a real kiss, the kind that made several passers-by glance their way. The car behind me honked because the light had turned green, but I couldn't move. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles had turned white, and I felt like someone had reached into my chest and was squeezing my heart. This couldn't be happening. Daniel didn't cheat. We talked about everything. Just last week we'd been planning our summer vacation, looking at rental houses on the beach, arguing playfully about whether we should go to Cape Cod or the Outer Banks. 3 days ago, he'd brought me coffee in bed and told me I was the best thing that ever happened to him. How could this be real? Another honk jolted me back to reality. I drove through the intersection, my mind racing, my vision blurry with tears I was trying desperately to hold back. I needed to think clearly, to figure out what to do next. Part of me wanted to turn the car around, confront them right there on the street, make a scene that would embarrass him as much as he'd just devastated me. But another part, the part that had spent 15 years with this man, needed to understand before I reacted. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe it was his cousin I'd never met. Maybe I was jumping to conclusions. Even as these thoughts crossed my mind, I knew I was grasping at straws. That kiss wasn't familial, and the way they'd been walking together wasn't innocent. I drove home on autopilot, barely registering the turns and stops. Our house, the one we'd bought 7 years ago and lovingly renovated together, suddenly felt like a stranger's home. I walked through the door into the living room where we'd spent countless evenings watching movies with the kids, into the kitchen where we'd cooked dinner together just last night, and everything looked the same but felt completely different. I paced back and forth, my phone in my hand, debating whether to call him, to text him, to demand an explanation immediately. But something stopped me. If I confronted him now, he'd have time to prepare his lies, to cover his tracks, to manipulate the situation. Instead, I did something I never thought I'd do. I opened his laptop, the one he usually kept in his home office. He'd never hidden his password from me. We had that kind of trust, the irony of which wasn't lost on me now. My hands were shaking as I typed it in, feeling like I was betraying our marriage even though he'd already destroyed it on that sidewalk. What I found made my stomach turn. Emails, dozens of them, going back almost 6 months. Her name was Vanessa, and she worked in the marketing department of his company. The emails started professionally enough, but quickly became flirtatious, then intimate, then explicit. There were plans for lunch dates, after work drinks, a weekend trip he'd told me was a work conference in Chicago. I sat there reading through months of deception, each email another knife in my heart. The worst part wasn't even the affair itself. It was the lies I now realized he'd been telling me. All those late nights at the office, the weekend he said he had to work on a big presentation, the business trip to Atlanta that I now suspected never happened. How many times had he kissed me, goodbye in the morning, knowing he was going to see her? How many times had he made love to me while thinking about someone else? How many family dinners had he sat through, playing the devoted husband and father while maintaining this secret life? I heard his car pull into the driveway around 6:30, his usual time. I'd been sitting in the dark living room for almost 3 hours, reading, thinking, crying, and then moving past crying into something colder and more calculated. When he walked through the door with his easy smile, calling out his usual greeting, asking what was for dinner, I felt a strange sense of detachment. This man, who I'd shared my life with, who I'd built dreams with, who I'd trusted completely, was a stranger. I'd been married to an illusion, and the real Daniel was someone I didn't know at all. I didn't confront him that night. I played along, made dinner, asked about his day, listened to him lie about a meeting that ran late. I tucked our kids into bed, reading them their bedtime stories while fighting back tears, thinking about how this was going to change their lives too. They adored their father, and I was going to have to be the one to shatter that for them eventually. That night, lying in bed next to him while he slept peacefully, I made a decision. I wasn't going to be the hysterical wife who fell apart. I was going to be smart about this. The next morning, I called my best friend Rachel, who also happened to be a divorce attorney. We met for coffee, and I told her everything. She listened without judgment, took notes, and then gave me advice that would change everything. Document everything, she said. Get copies of bank statements, credit card bills, emails, text messages. Protect yourself financially. Open your own bank account if you don't have one. And whatever you do, don't let him know that you know. Not yet. Give yourself time to prepare, to line up your ducks, to make sure you're in the strongest possible position when you finally pull the trigger. I spent the next 2 weeks living a double life of my own. On the surface, I was the same Jessica, making breakfast, dropping kids at school, going to my job as a graphic designer, cooking dinner, maintaining our routine. But underneath, I was methodically gathering evidence. I took screenshots of every email, every text message I could find. I discovered he'd been using our joint credit card to pay for hotel rooms, expensive dinners, gifts that never came home. To me. I found florist receipts for bouquets I never received. I opened a separate bank account and started funneling money into it, small amounts that wouldn't be noticed, but would give me a cushion for what was coming. I also did something else. I hired a private investigator, a recommendation from Rachel. It felt dramatic, like something from a movie, but I needed concrete evidence, documentation that would hold up in court if it came to that. The investigator, a former cop named Mike, was professional and surprisingly compassionate. He followed Daniel for a week and came back with photographs and a detailed report that was even worse than I'd imagined. Daniel wasn't just having an affair. He and Vanessa were playing house. They'd been to her apartment multiple times, had gone away together on 3 separate weekends over the past 4 months. And according to what Mike had observed, they were acting like a serious couple, not just a fling. Armed with all this information, I consulted with Rachel about the best way forward. She advised me to be strategic. We lived in a no-fault divorce state, but the financial infidelity, using marital assets to fund an affair, could work in my favor. We put together a comprehensive documentation package, everything I'd found plus Mike's report. Then Rachel helped me draft a separation agreement that was favorable to me and the kids, including primary custody, child support, and a division of assets that reflected my contributions to the marriage and the home we'd built. But before I filed anything, I decided to do something unexpected. I wanted to meet Vanessa, to see for myself who this woman was that my husband had chosen over our family. I knew where she worked, had seen her office building in some of the surveillance photos. One afternoon, I walked into the building, asked the receptionist for Vanessa Morrison, and said I was there to drop something off. When she came down to the lobby, clearly confused about who could be visiting her, I introduced myself simply as Daniel's wife. The color drained from her face instantly. She stammered something about not knowing what I was talking about, but I cut her off calmly. I told her I wasn't there to make a scene. I just wanted her to know that I knew, and that she should probably ask Daniel about the wife and 2 children he apparently forgot to mention. Then I handed her a manila envelope containing copies of some of the emails and photos, turned around, and walked out. My hands were shaking and my heart was pounding, but I felt a strange sense of empowerment. I'd taken control of the narrative instead of being a victim of it. That evening, Daniel came home in a panic. Vanessa had obviously called him immediately after I left. He walked in the door, white-faced and sweating, asking if we could talk. I told him calmly that yes, we absolutely needed to talk, but first I needed to get the kids settled at my mother's house for the night. I'd already called her earlier, told her I needed her to watch them for an evening without explaining why. She'd agreed immediately, sensing something was seriously wrong. After I dropped the kids off, I drove back home, taking my time, preparing myself for what was coming. When I walked back into our house, Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. He started talking before I even sat down, a rush of words that was clearly a prepared speech. He was sorry. It had been a mistake. It didn't mean anything. He loved me and the kids. He wanted to work things out. All the cliches that cheating spouses trot out when they get caught. I let him talk, just watching him, this man I thought I knew. When he finally ran out of steam and looked at me with what he probably thought were soulful, apologetic eyes, I pulled out my own folder. I laid it all out on the table. The emails going back 6 months, the credit card statements showing hotels and restaurants, the florist receipts, Mike's surveillance report with its detailed timeline and photographs, bank statements showing the money he'd been spending. I watched his face change as he realized how thoroughly I'd documented his betrayal. Then I told him about meeting Vanessa, about the envelope I'd given her. His expression shifted from apologetic to defensive to angry in a matter of seconds. He actually had the audacity to ask me how I could violate his privacy by going through his emails and hiring someone to follow him. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. He was angry at me for discovering his affair, as if I was the one who'd done something wrong. That moment crystallized something for me. Whatever love I'd had for this man was completely dead. I didn't feel hurt anymore, just a cold clarity about what needed to happen next. I told him I wanted a divorce, that I'd already consulted with an attorney, and that he had 2 choices. He could agree to my terms, sign the separation agreement Rachel had drawn up, and we could handle this civilly for the sake of our children. Or he could fight me, and I would make sure everyone knew exactly why our marriage ended, starting with his boss and HR department at his company. Daniel tried several different tactics over the next hour. He cried, said it was a midlife crisis, begged for another chance, promised he'd go to counseling, even suggested we could have an open marriage if that would help. When none of that worked, he got angry again, accused me of being cold and unforgiving, said I was overreacting to what was just a physical thing that didn't threaten our real relationship. I just sat there, unmoved by any of it, and repeated my ultimatum. Sign the agreement, or face a very public and messy divorce that would likely cost him his job on top of everything else. In the end, faced with the mountain of evidence and the threat to his career, Daniel signed. It took 2 more meetings with both our lawyers present, some negotiation on specific terms, but 3 weeks after I saw him on that street corner, we had a legally binding separation agreement. He moved out the following weekend, taking his clothes and personal items, but leaving the house and most of our assets with me and the kids. I got primary custody with him having visitation every other weekend and 1 evening a week. The child support and spousal support were fair, more than fair actually, reflecting both his income and the circumstances of our split. Telling the kids was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. They were 9 and 7, old enough to know something was wrong, but too young to really understand adult complexities. I kept it simple. Told them that Daddy and I had some problems we couldn't fix, that he was going to live somewhere else but he still loved them very much, and that none of this was their fault. My daughter cried, asking if it was because of something she'd done. My son, always more reserved, just nodded and asked if he could still have his sleepover party next month. Kids process things differently than adults, and watching them navigate this pain I couldn't protect them from was agonizing. The first few months were brutal. I was angry, grieving, exhausted from managing everything on my own and trying to maintain normalcy for the kids. Well-meaning friends offered sympathy that sometimes felt more like pity. Some people took sides, stopped inviting Daniel to group events, which was satisfying in a petty way, but also sad because it meant our entire social circle was fracturing along with our marriage. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects that kept my mind occupied. I started going to therapy, which I probably should have done years earlier, and began unpacking not just the affair, but patterns in our relationship I'd ignored or excused. What I slowly began to realize was that the affair, as devastating as it was, had actually freed me from something I hadn't even known was constraining me. My entire adult life had been built around being Daniel's wife, being a mother to our children, and somewhere along the way, I'd lost track of who Jessica was as an individual. I'd given up career opportunities because they would have required travel or longer hours that didn't fit with our family structure. I'd moved to the suburbs because it was better for raising kids, even though I'd loved living in the city. I'd made 1,000 small compromises over the years that had seemed reasonable at the time, but had slowly eroded my sense of self. About 6 months after the separation, something unexpected happened. I got a call from a former colleague who'd started her own design agency. She'd seen some work I'd posted online and wanted to know if I'd be interested in joining her company as a partner, not just an employee. It was a risk. Startups are always uncertain, but it was also an opportunity to do the kind of creative work I'd always dreamed about. The old Jessica, Daniel's wife, would have probably said no, worried about the stability, the benefits, the safe paycheck. But this new version of myself said yes without hesitation. The business took off faster than either of us expected. My partner Melissa and I worked incredibly well together, and within a year we'd built a client roster that included several major brands. I was making more money than I ever had, but more importantly, I was doing work I was passionate about. I was traveling for client meetings, attending industry conferences, building a professional reputation that was mine alone. The kids adjusted to having a mom who was busier but also happier and more fulfilled. We hired a wonderful nanny for after-school coverage, and I made sure that when I was with my children, I was fully present. My personal life evolved too. I'd assumed I'd be single for a long time, maybe forever. The idea of trusting someone again seemed impossible. But about 1.5 years after the divorce was finalized, I met someone at one of those industry conferences. His name was Marcus, he owned a small tech company, and he was recently divorced himself. We started as friends, two people who understood the complexity of rebuilding your life after a marriage ends. He was patient, understanding when I had trust issues, never pushed for more than I was ready to give. Slowly, carefully, I opened my heart again, surprised to discover I was still capable of falling in love. As for Daniel, karma had its own plans for him. His relationship with Vanessa imploded about 6 months after I confronted her. Apparently, she hadn't appreciated discovering she was the other woman and that he'd lied to her too. His performance at work suffered, whether from personal drama or just bad luck, and he ended up leaving that company under unclear circumstances. He moved to a smaller firm with lower pay, which meant his support payments had to be renegotiated. He remarried eventually to someone else entirely, and from what I hear through the kids, that relationship is rocky too. Turns out when you build a relationship on deception and betrayal, you shouldn't be surprised when trust issues follow you. The kids split their time between our homes, and while it's not ideal, They've adapted better than I feared. They have two parents who love them, even if those parents can't be in the same room without tension. My daughter told me once that she liked that I seemed happier now, that I laughed more than I used to. That observation from a 12-year-old cut deep made me realize that I'd been unhappy longer than I'd admitted to myself, that Daniel and I had been coasting on routine rather than actual connection for years before Vanessa ever entered the picture. Looking back now, almost 4 years after that Thursday afternoon when I saw my husband kissing another woman on a downtown street, I can honestly say it was the worst thing and the best thing that ever happened to me. The worst because betrayal and divorce are painful, because my kids had to experience their parents separating, because I had to rebuild my entire life from scratch in my late 30s. The best, because it forced me to discover who I actually was underneath all the roles I'd been playing. It taught me that I was stronger than I thought, more capable than I'd given myself credit for, and that sometimes what looks like an ending is actually a beginning. I'm not grateful for the affair. I wouldn't wish that pain on anyone. But I am grateful for what I did with it. Instead of falling apart or staying stuck in victimhood, I took control. I documented everything, protected myself financially, made strategic decisions instead of emotional ones, and then used the freedom that came from the divorce to build a life that was authentically mine. I started a successful business, found love again with someone who treats me with respect and honesty, and became a better mother by becoming a happier, more complete person. People sometimes ask me if I ever saw signs that Daniel was cheating, if there were red flags I missed. Honestly, I don't know. Maybe there were, and I ignored them. Or maybe he was just good at compartmentalizing his double life. What I do know is that the signs don't matter as much as what you do when you discover the truth. You can let betrayal define you and destroy you, or you can let it refine you and rebuild you into something stronger. The other day, I was downtown for a client meeting, and I found myself walking down 5th Street, the same street where I'd seen Daniel with Vanessa 4 years ago. I stopped for a moment, remembering that feeling of my world collapsing, the pain and shock and disbelief. And then I kept walking, heading to a meeting for my thriving business, planning to pick up my kids afterward and take them to dinner, knowing that Marcus and I had tickets to a show this weekend. That woman whose heart broke on this street corner barely exists anymore. She's been replaced by someone who knows her, worth, who doesn't settle, who built a life she loves from the ashes of the one that burned down. What happened next after I saw my husband with another woman didn't change my life in the way I expected that terrible Thursday afternoon. It didn't destroy me like I thought it would. Instead, it freed me to become who I was always meant to be. And for that, despite everything, I'm thankful.